Warning, this episode may contain disturbing content, soothing narration, and mild existential dread. Basically, murder ASMR for stressed professionals. Listener discretion is advised. Hell, it might be necessary.
Some people think accountability begins with an apology. It doesn't. Accountability begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment you realize what you've done, the moment you could tell the truth, but don't, the moment you could warn people, but instead you run. The moment that you could accept responsibility, but instead build a wall between yourself and the damage, depriving victims of justice. It's cowardice that kills accountability. At Seton Hall, a reckless prank ended lives, severely injured dozens of people, and left lifelong scars. And when faced with the choice of accepting responsibility, the accused arsonists instead wrapped themselves in a cloak of cowardice, choosing silence and denial over truth and consequences. Joseph Lepore and Sean Ryan behaved like cowards. Their families are alleged to have not only supported them, but encouraged their refusal to take accountability. But for the families of Sean Simons and Alvaro Llanos, there is no refusing the reality of what Lepore and Ryan's reckless actions did. The physical and psychological scars are lifelong, an incessant reminder of the cowardice of two college students. But Sean and Alvaro chose a different path. They chose to leave a legacy of advocacy, of safety, of protection that they themselves were not afforded. A legacy far too powerful to be dwarfed by the cowardice of the men who caused their suffering. Today we're going to talk about the investigation, the silence, and the eventual arrests of the two students who set Boland Hall on fire that January night in 2000. And if you came here looking for justice, you may leave disappointed. But despite the failures of accountability in this case, there is no denying the legacy left behind. The work of survivors like Sean Simons and Alvaro Llanos, who turned unimaginable tragedy into a catalyst for change. Big change. Meaningful change. This is part 2 of Pranks, Panic, and Pleas, the Seton Hall fire, right now on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer, former firefighter, and somehow still battling the plague after almost a month. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We're so glad you're here. And we have just one tiny favor to ask. Head into your podcast player and leave us a 5-star rating. On Apple Podcasts, a 1-sentence review is hugely appreciated. And on Spotify and Podbean, you can leave episode comments. That engagement tells the algorithm this podcast is worth sharing with more people, and that matters for indie podcasts like us. Because we don't have PR teams. We spend our money on court records so we can bring you deeply researched episodes. If you'd like to help offset those court record costs, and guys, our next series is already setting us back almost $2,000, we'd love to welcome you over on Patreon. We have 3 membership tiers, and another free sticker drop is coming next month. If you join as a paid member by the end of March, you'll be eligible to receive our exclusive Cult of Steve stickers, which I should probably get around to designing. If Patreon isn't in the budget right now, no worries, because we will always be free with ads on your favorite podcast platform. You can also help us out by interacting with our posts on social media. Likes, comments, shares, saves, all of that helps new listeners find the show. I haven't been posting much lately because, again, I am still sick, and producing episodes while fighting whatever medieval illness I have picked up has been a journey, but we're still moving forward. And if you've never experienced the thrill of the Crime to Burn logo against your mortal flesh, the spread shop link is in the show notes.
But you probably will have to wear it inside out.
Maybe.
I don't think they're all the way through. I wouldn't wear it if that thing was on the inside.
Right. But you could get a coffee cup and hold it in your mortal flesh and touch the logo.
That's true. I didn't think of that.
We also love hearing from you. Send us your fire stories, case suggestions, episode feedback, and especially unhinged ideas for things my husband and co-host should attempt in the waffle maker. He recently acquired one and has begun what can be only described as a personal Will It Waffle mission, and yes, he has bought the cookbook. A few quick shout-outs before we dive in. Heather Renee, thank you for congratulating us on our 100th episode over on Spotify in the comments. Now, we are up to 69 5-star ratings on Spotify, which we all appreciate for its cultural significance. But we're mature enough to accept additional ratings. Over on Apple Podcasts, we're sitting at 67, so if 2 of you would like to help us make that number more immature, you know what to do. We've also had some Podbean comments to the user who called us very annoying and asked why, quote, the guy keeps cracking like a duck, unquote.
Did you say cracking?
He said cracking. The word you're looking for is quacking, and that is how we cover curse words to avoid getting flagged as explicit content. I hope that helps clear things up for you. We're fighting curses with ducks. Becky Beasley, thank you again for your latest comment. We missed you too. Tony, welcome, and we're glad you found us. And Mama Mac, we put the bloopers at the end so listeners who prefer just the story can stop at those 3 beeps and skip the banter and inappropriate jokes entirely. Some listeners love the bloopers and some don't, and this way everyone wins. We hope you stick around, and we totally understand if you skip the bloopers. And finally, to the Instagram user who spent hours yesterday morning liking our entire feed, I see you. I appreciate you. And while it was mildly stalker adjacent, I am grateful for you anyway. Your account is private, so I won't call you out, but thanks for using your fingers to tickle the algorithm. All right, let's get back to Seton Hall. A quick recap from last week. On January 19th, 2000, a fire broke out in Boland Hall, the freshman dormitory, or one of the freshman dormitories at Seton Hall University, around 4:30 in the morning. The building did not have sprinklers, but the fire alarm did sound. The problem was that prank fire alarms in Boland Hall had become so common that many students assumed it was just another false alarm, that there was no urgency to get out of their rooms. For students on the 3rd floor, by the time they realized this was a real fire, the corridors were already filling with dense black smoke and the heat was unbearable. Dozens of students were injured. Among them were Alvaro Llanos and Sean Simons, who both suffered catastrophic burns. They spent months in the burn unit and years recovering from their injuries. Tragically, 3 young men did not survive: Aaron Carroll, Frank Caltabliata Jr., and John Guenta. And a quick correction from last week. I pronounced John Guenta's last name as Junta based on what the internet told me, but I've since heard from listeners that in New Jersey it's more commonly pronounced Quinta. That pronunciation makes a lot more sense to me, so if that is the correct way to say it, I sincerely apologize for my mistake last week. Almost immediately, investigators began trying to determine how the fire started. They interviewed hundreds of students, asking what they saw, what they heard, and what they did in the moments before the alarm sounded. And a few details began to stand out. Earlier that night, there had been a disturbance in the 3rd floor lounge. Freshman resident Sean Ryan had gotten into a wrestling match with a fraternity brother, and a resident advisor eventually threw everyone out of the room. A student with a room near the lounge told police that just before the alarm sounded, he heard the sound of paper ripping. Another student on the 3rd floor reported hearing footsteps leaving a nearby room just before the alarm, followed by the sound of someone running back inside moments later. But at this point in the investigation, nothing was certain. Investigators couldn't rule anything out. They had to follow the evidence wherever it led. Now, we've talked before about how fire investigators determine a fire's point of origin. There's a traditional theory that the origin of a fire is simply the place where there is the most damage. Now, we've talked before about how investigators determine a fire's point of origin. There's a traditional theory that the origin of a fire is simply the place where there is the most damage. I've criticized that idea before because the intensity of a fire is often driven more by airflow than by fuel load, especially in a compartment like this one. But that doesn't mean investigators can't use damage patterns as part of the analysis. They just don't rely on that alone. One of the things investigators look for is something called shadowing. Now, shadowing happens when an object blocks heat or smoke from reaching a surface behind it. For example, if a chair or table sits in front of a wall, the area directly behind it might show less soot or less charring than the surface surrounding it. And that shadowing can tell investigators something important, like which direction the fire moved through a space. It shows where heat and flames were and where they couldn't have been. By studying those patterns, the areas that burned intensely and the areas that were shielded, and combining that with where they see the most damage, investigators can begin to reconstruct how a fire moved through the space. So they can combine the damage patterns, the shadowing, and many other investigative techniques. I'm not going to get into all of them here. And in this case, everything pointed to the same place. The fire's point of origin was in the vicinity of a couch in the third-floor lounge. But determining the point of origin is only the first step. Once investigators know where a fire started, they still have to determine how it started. And that part can be extremely difficult because fires have a very nasty habit of destroying the very evidence that might explain them. So investigators have to get hands-on, very hands-on, literally, like they dig. They use shovels, sifters, and very careful documentation. Investigators comb through the ash and debris layer by layer in the area of origin, looking for anything that might explain the ignition source. They'll also examine potential accidental causes. They'll look for things like electrical outlets that might have shorted, wiring, or appliances that could have malfunctioned. But in the third-floor lounge, investigators found no reasonable accidental ignition sources. There was no evidence of an electrical failure, no appliance malfunction, which meant investigators had to begin considering a different possibility, that the fire had been set, either accidentally or intentionally. An accidentally set fire might be something like a cigarette dropped onto upholstered furniture. An intentionally set fire, of course, is arson. Investigators needed to understand exactly what the lounge looked like before the fire, and what was in the room, and what could have burned first. And as they began reconstructing the space, they learned something important. A large paper banner had been hanging over the couch. Suddenly, the statement from a student living near the lounge became much more interesting. He had told police that just before the alarm sounded, he heard the sound of paper tearing. Investigators also knew that earlier that night there had been a disturbance in that same lounge, a party that had ended when a resident advisor forced everyone out of the room. Now they had a potential fuel source and a suspicious sound, and a room that had been occupied shortly before the fire began. Investigators started to seriously consider the possibility that the fire had been deliberately set, but suspicion isn't proof. Before investigators could call this arson, they needed more. With no clear accidental ignition source and no evidence of accelerants, investigators turned to the people who had been there that night, the students. What had they seen? What had they heard? And most importantly, who had been in the lounge just before the fire started? Now, a student who lived in the room next door to Sean Ryan and Joseph Lepore told investigators that shortly after the lounge was cleared out, he heard people running into and then back out of Ryan and Lepore's room. Now, Ryan and Lepore already had something of a reputation in Boland Hall. Their classmates had given them the nickname Beavis and Butthead. And remember, it was Ryan's wrestling match that had triggered the commotion that got the party in the lounge shut down in the first place. So investigators had to ask themselves a question. Could the fire have been some sort of retaliation? Maybe a drunken prank. A moment of reckless payback for the dressing down everyone in the lounge had just received from the resident advisor. Because college pranks are one thing, but sometimes the prank turns into something much, much worse. 2 days after the fire, a meeting was taking place at a Dunkin' Donuts. Several students gathered there and made a pact. They would not cooperate with investigators. They would not tell the police what they knew about the fire. But investigators wouldn't learn about that meeting until much later. 4 days after the fire, Sean Ryan found himself sitting in a police station answering questions. He admitted that he had been horsing around in the lounge earlier that night. He acknowledged that he lived on the third floor. But as the interview stretched on, reports say Ryan eventually became very emotional, at one point growing weepy and impatient to leave. Eventually, he told investigators that the worst thing he had done that night was pull down the paper banner that had been hanging over the couch in the lounge. Ryan would not have known that investigators had already taken a statement from another student who reported hearing the sound of paper tearing in the lounge just before the fire alarm sounded. To the officers in that room, Ryan's admission felt like a door cracking open. The banner had been hanging directly above the couch, the same couch investigators had identified as the point of origin for the fire. Ryan's statement suddenly lined up with witness accounts about the tearing paper, and with that, investigators' confidence that this fire had been deliberately set began to grow stronger. One of the officers pushed Ryan a little further. Hypothetically, he asked, if you knew who set the fire, would you tell us? Ryan's response was simple. He said he was no rat. But by that point, Ryan seemed to have realized that he'd already said more than he intended. He abruptly ended the interview, telling investigators that he would have to return the next day to finish his statement. But before he left, police asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph when he came back, and Ryan agreed. But he never returned to the station. He never finished his statement, and he never took the polygraph. Investigators, however, were not surprised. And slowly the cooperation of the students, or at least the students investigators most wanted to talk to, began to dry up. The people in Sean Ryan and Joey Lepore's inner circle all clammed up. Some of them hired attorneys. Some refused to speak with investigators at all. And investigators began to suspect that this group of fraternity brothers knew far more than they were willing to admit. Police also knew that if the silence continued much longer, that there was a real chance this case would stall completely. So they convened a grand jury. Now, it's important to understand what a grand jury actually does. This isn't a trial to determine guilt or innocence. A grand jury actually serves an investigative function. Witnesses are subpoenaed and compelled to testify under oath about what they know. If you're called before a grand jury, you can hire an attorney, but the attorney isn't allowed inside the room with you when you testify. If you're asked a question that you're unsure how to answer, you can request a pause and step outside to consult with your lawyer before continuing. You can also retain your Fifth Amendment rights, meaning that you can refuse to answer any question that would incriminate you. In some cases, prosecutors may offer immunity, which means that the testimony you give to the grand jury can't be used to prosecute you in order to compel you to speak. But if you lie under oath in a grand jury proceeding, you can be charged with perjury. Now, in theory, this system works well, but there was a problem. Serving subpoenas to a group of fraternity brothers who had clearly begun circling the wagons was going to be a challenge. Each subpoena has to be personally served. That means physically handed to the person named on it. And the people who know they're about to be subpoenaed can sometimes make themselves very difficult to find. More than one legal proceeding has been delayed because investigators simply couldn't serve a key witness. Add in protective parents and newly hired attorneys, and investigators had reasons to believe that getting subpoenas into the hands of every witness that they needed might get complicated. But investigators had another problem too. Some of Ryan's fraternity brothers had already spoken with police before everyone clammed up. And from those conversations, investigators learned something very interesting. Sean Ryan had told at least 4 different versions of what had happened the night of the fire. Investigators now wanted to know exactly who had heard what and when, so they came up with a plan. A plan that some people would call ingenious and others might call a bit nefarious, but I'll let you decide. Friday nights meant $3 beers at a bar called The Hall, and Sean Ryan's fraternity brothers were practically guaranteed to be there. So at 1:23 a.m., police made their move. Officers swarmed the bar for what looked like a routine ID check targeting underage drinkers. Students were lined up, IDs were collected, ages were verified, and while Sean Ryan's fraternity brothers were conveniently gathered in one place with their IDs out, investigators took the opportunity to do something else. They served them. One by one, each student was handed a grand jury subpoena. No dodging service, no hiding from investigators. Now they would be compelled to testify. For prosecutors, this was the moment they decided to stop waiting for cooperation and start forcing it. It wasn't the end of the investigation, but it was the first real crack in the wall of silence. And witness testimony was going to be crucial because the forensic evidence had given investigators very little that could directly tie anyone to the crime. The real breakthrough, however, came a little bit later. After testifying before the grand jury, one of Ryan's fraternity brothers contacted investigators and told them that he had, quote, remembered something he hadn't mentioned on the stand, unquote. 2 days after the fire, he said, he had been summoned to a Dunkin' Donuts. Sean Ryan was there, Joey Lepore was there, and another student. And inside that Dunkin' Donuts, these 4 young men made a pact. They agreed that none of them would reveal what they knew about the fire. Now, investigators were able to verify this part of the story because they got security footage from the restaurant and confirmed that this meeting had actually taken place. And to police, that raised a very obvious question. Because people don't usually hold quiet meetings to swear each other to secrecy unless they have something to hide. The grand jury agreed. Once the witness was brought back in to testify, the grand jury returned indictments against Sean Ryan and Joseph Lepore, charging them with arson, aggravated assault, reckless manslaughter, and felony murder. Now, any good defense attorney would point out that an alleged meeting at a Dunkin' Donuts is just evidence of an impending sugar high, not really evidence of a crime, and they wouldn't be wrong. But Ryan and Lepore were not the only people indicted. The grand jury also indicted members of Lepore's family, his parents, and his sister, not for setting the fire, but for allegedly helping cover up his role in it. A grand jury isn't deciding guilt or innocence. They're simply determining whether there is enough evidence to move the case forward to a trial. Charges can still be reduced or even dropped. Plea deals can be negotiated. But you're probably asking a different question. What did witnesses reveal to the grand jury that dragged Joseph Lepore's parents and sister into this case? And I'd love to tell you, but grand jury records are usually sealed. So we don't know exactly what was said behind those closed doors, but we do know why Lepore's family ended up facing charges. And this part of the story is a doozy. Enter Thomas Ricciardi, a mafia hitman who was now working as a police informant. 8 years before the Seton Hall fire, Ricciardi had admitted to playing a role in 9 murders. He had also been convicted of beating a man from the Lucchese crime family to death with a golf club. Facing a very long prison sentence, Ricciardi made a deal with law enforcement. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he agreed to cooperate with investigators and act as an informant, and he delivered. Ricciardi helped authorities secure convictions against members of several New York organized crime families, including the Lucchese, Colombo, and Genovese crime families. But before he finished serving his reduced prison sentence, Ricciardi contacted prosecutors again. He said he had information about the Seton Hall fire. In exchange for shaving even more time off his sentence, he was willing to share what he knew. Ricciardi told investigators that his brother, Daniel Bobo Ricciardi, was dating a friend of Joey Lepore's mother who had confided in this person about the crime, or that's the story according to the book. But according to the documentary, Joey Lepore's mother had approached our friend Bobo for advice on proceeding because her son was involved. And I'm not sure which is true, but what a can of worms. Whatever Ricciardi told investigators was persuasive enough that a judge authorized a warrant to bug the Lepore family's home and phone. Now you might be wondering how police were able to legally wiretap someone's home, because without a warrant, that would absolutely be illegal. But under federal law, and New Jersey law as well, investigators can request what's called a Title III wiretap order. And judges don't hand those out lightly. To get one, prosecutors have to show several things. First, they have to establish probable cause that a specific serious crime had been committed, things like murder, arson, or organized crime activity. Second, they have to show probable cause that the people being monitored are involved in the crime. Third, they have to demonstrate that intercepting communications is likely to produce evidence related to the crime. And finally, and this is the big one, they have to show that normal investigative methods have already failed or are unlikely to succeed. Things like interviews, surveillance, subpoenas, and search warrants. Wiretaps are considered a last resort investigative tool, so prosecutors have to convince a judge that they've basically run out of other options. If a judge agrees that those conditions are met, then they may issue a wiretap order. Those orders are very specific. They name the people who can be monitored, the phone lines or locations that can be tapped, and they usually only last about 30 days at a time unless investigators come back to the court to renew them. In the Seton Hall case, prosecutors were able to persuade a judge that they had probable cause and the traditional investigative methods weren't breaking through the wall of silence surrounding the fire. So the judge signed off on a warrant to bug the Lepore family's home and phone. Once investigators started listening, they began hearing conversations about the fire. Those recording devices captured at least 9 conversations about the fire, including one discussion about a plan to take Joey out of the country rather than risk his arrest. But that wasn't all. In those recorded conversations, Lepore's mother had also told her husband and children that they needed to lie to investigators. And those conversations would eventually lead to charges of witness tampering against members of the Lepore family. So police had their indictments. And they also knew that the Lepore family had discussed getting Joey out of the country. And at that point, investigators had not yet arrested Lepore, but they were watching him, tracking his movements. And they noticed something that raised alarms. Lepore was going from bank to bank withdrawing money. To investigators, it looked like someone preparing to flee the country, and they decided it was time to move. When police moved in to arrest him, Lepore tried to escape, even ramming one of the police cars with his vehicle in an attempt to get away. but the attempt didn't work. He was taken into custody. Sean Ryan's arrest was less dramatic. He was arrested on his way out of a tanning booth. Investigators later reported that Ryan and Lepore were anything but remorseful after their arrest. Officers described their attitudes as arrogant and suggested they believed that they would be back home before the arresting officers even finished their shift. A judge set bail for each of them at $2 million cash only. That meant the full amount had to be posted. No bail bondsman, no 10%, the entire amount. Both families posted bail. While investigators were conducting interviews, issuing subpoenas, and pursuing wiretaps, fire investigators were working on a completely different question. Could this fire have started accidentally? Specifically, could it have been caused by a dropped cigarette? And to answer that question, investigators constructed a replica of the lounge using similar furniture and paper materials to recreate the conditions present that night. They tested cigarettes in different orientations, with the paper, without the paper, under the paper, on top of the paper, in a paper fold, like all kinds of orientations.
They just sit and lit cigarettes at it for like 30 minutes and nothing happened, right?
And they were looking to see whether they could reproduce the fire with a cigarette, and they couldn't. But when the materials were ignited with a match, the fire developed in a way that was consistent with what investigators had observed at Boland Hall. Once Ryan and Lepore were charged, however, their defense attorneys hired their own expert witness to challenge the state's testing. Several articles discussing the case mention criticisms of those experiments, but I was unable to locate detailed documentation describing exactly what flaws the defense experts believed invalidated the results. Some criticisms mentioned things like failure to measure gas release rates, but that type of critique usually means you just have fewer data points that were collected, not necessarily that the results themselves were invalid. Other criticisms suggested that there were discrepancies in the furniture used during the tests, but unfortunately the sources that I found didn't clearly describe what those differences were. Because of that, I can't tell you whether the state's fire testing was completely reliable or not. Also, I can't tell you whether the defense's experts' criticisms were fully justified. What I can tell you is that if this case had gone to trial, it likely would have become a battle of expert witnesses, each side arguing over whose interpretation of the fire science was more credible. Because in the end, the case against Ryan and Lepore was largely circumstantial. There was no direct physical evidence placing either of them in the lounge or either of them holding a match or a lighter. None. What investigators had instead was a collection of witness statements, people who saw something, heard something, or were told something after the fire. So despite the fact that 3 people died, and despite the fact that 58 people were injured, and despite the fact that many of those injuries were severe and life-altering, Joseph Lepore and Sean Ryan accepted plea deals. Each agreed to serve 5 years in state prison with eligibility for parole much earlier. Also, the charges against Lepore's family were dropped. At sentencing, both men made very brief statements apologizing for what happened, but the statements were short and carefully worded, and to many observers, myself included, and the victims' families, they lacked genuine remorse or full acceptance of responsibility. Sean Ryan ultimately served about 27 months, just over 2 years. Joseph Lepore served approximately 34 months, or just under 3 years. And that isn't the end of this story, because what happened after the fire is the true legacy of it. Sean Simons has agreed to join us on the podcast and talk about what life looked like in the years that followed, the recovery, the advocacy, and the work that he and others have done to change fire safety laws. And I believe Alvaro Llanos is going to be joining him as well. I want you to hear directly from them in their own words about the legacy that came out of this tragedy. Hopefully, we'll have that conversation ready for you next week on Crime to Burn, but it depends on scheduling. And if not next week, we'll be bringing you that episode very soon. Because this story does not end with the fire. And before we sign off, it's important to talk about what did change after the fire. New Jersey passed legislation requiring automatic sprinkler protection in all student housing. However, other states have been slower to adopt similar requirements for existing buildings. Under the International Building Code, new dormitories are required to have sprinklers, but in most states, older buildings constructed before those requirements existed are grandfathered in. That means sprinklers usually only have to be installed if major renovations trigger a requirement for the building to be brought up to current code. Smaller renovations, things like minor remodels and routine repairs, typically don't trigger those upgrades. And that's why retrofitting existing buildings with sprinkler systems remains one of the biggest challenges in improving fire safety. The cost can be significant, And unfortunately, some lessons have to be learned the hard way, and sometimes more than once, before meaningful changes can happen. But the evidence is clear. Sprinklers save lives, and progress is possible. And that's this week's episode, and we'll be back next week on Crime to Burn. Say goodbye to my pants. I will be throwing them away because they have a hole right here. This is my pants' last stand.
I could just tear them off you later.
You probably could, yeah. Most of it's like breath sounds and awkward pauses.
Have you ever heard of a chemical called cinnamaldehyde?
No, but it sounds like it tastes like cinnamon, but it'll kill you.
I don't know if this is an AI hallucination or a real chemical. Someone's going to be reading Are You Googly?
Get out of the wine rack. Look, if this falls, a lot of stuff breaks. Get out of there. Go out the way you came in.
She's so adorable. Idiot, though. The lady struggled with the kitten.
I can't get her out. You obviously fit through the holes.
It's like a hermit crab. Couldn't want to come out of its shell.
Pick a hole and go out. Come on.
You know what? I'm going to solve two problems at once.
How?
With my superior intellect. And power tools.
Sometimes you have to pause recording for home renovation. Now that the wine rack is kitten-proof, we can get back to what we started. Testing, testing, testing.
My patience.
Just rambling.
Sounds like a delicious way to preserve like a whole foot.
Do we have a foot we need to preserve?
No.
Okay. I'm just making sure, because you never know. Well, I don't know what you've been up to. I've been very busy. But I wouldn't judge you if you had a foot we needed to preserve. I would wonder why we wanted to preserve it. The Chaos Donkey has been rubbed down with a wet towel to try to remove the mud.
I haven't found the hole yet.
We haven't found the hole yet.
That's what she said.
I had a dream about Apple Care.
About Apple Care?
Yeah, like I was trying to
like insurance for your devices?
Yeah, like I don't remember the whole scenario, but I remember I was trying to deal with Apple Care to get my phone replaced or something.
Man, you gotta do something. You're having some mundane dreams.
I am. I think it's because the books that I'm listening to are so unhinged. My subconscious is just like, we need normalcy.
Change the fax paper. Give you the tingle feels.
But when the trigger warning includes accidental cannibalism, I mean, how can you not listen? I wanted to find out how you accidentally cannibalize someone.
Good marketing.
Right? This is actually the second book I read that had accidental cannibalism in the trigger warnings.
Let's preserve each other's delusion. I thought we were making fun of a willy.
We were trying to make fun of a willy, but we skated across the line somewhere.
Face planted right over the line. You can't sniff the line without crossing the line. We all know this.
But despite the failures of accountability in this case, there is no denying that the legacy left behind, the work of survivors like Sean Simons and Alvaro Llanos, who turned unimaginable tragedy into a catalyst for change, is not a complete sentence. And if you've never experienced the thrill of crime,
You've never experienced the thrill of crime.
For prosecutors, I really have a pee problem. I just can't without peeing. A grand jury isn't deciding guilt or innocence. They're simply determining... Is it already beer o'clock? I haven't even had breakfast yet. I'm going to drink before breakfast like a girl that drinks before breakfast.
It's a brave new world of fire protection.
It's a brave new world. Let's protect the kids. So, Mafia hitman broke the case open.
Beat a guy to death with a golf club.
I know. Yeah.
Gross.
I want to know which club it was.
I don't.
Like,
what is wrong with you?
Like, was it a putter or a driver?
Doesn't matter.
Chipping wedge?
Gross.
9-iron? the emotions I just saw go across your face. So tell me, have you ever been to a tanning bed?
Never.
Never.
Not once. Still waiting for my platypus design to come out. What was that cult that was like doing coffee high colonics and boof in the sun? And now a quick public service announcement. If you have recently been advised by the internet to go outside and sun your taint in order to increase energy, balance hormones, or activate your inner wolf spirit, please consider the following. The skin in that region is not designed for direct solar charging. Sunburn there can lead to swelling, blistering, difficulty sitting, difficulty walking, and an entirely new appreciation for loose-fitting sweatpants. Additionally, the state of California would like you to know that prolonged exposure of sensitive anatomical regions to ultraviolet radiation may cause reproductive harm, which seems like an unnecessary and complicated way to say don't cook the family jewels. If you absolutely must absorb sunlight for wellness purposes, try something safer. For example, your arms, or perhaps your face. This has been a public service announcement. Stop boofing the sun. This episode is brought to you by delinquent frat boys, reminding us that sometimes the greatest threat to public safety isn't organized crime. It's a circle jerk and a bad idea. This episode is brought to you by tanning beds, providing a warm place to reflect on your choices, right up until the police arrive.
At least you'll be nicely bronzed in your mugshot. And that's all for today. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and if someone invites you to a secret meeting at a Dunkin' Donuts to swear eternal silence, maybe just get a coffee and leave.
Love one another and pass the military-grade lubricant.
Crime to Burn is a production of Crime to Burn, LLC, where we light fires in your brain and not your buildings. All rights reserved. Still spiritually parched after this episode? It's okay, Steve believes in cross-pollination. Here's a trailer for a show we think deserves to infiltrate your ear holes, in a good way. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review before you go. Steve is watching.
Looking for your next true crime podcast? Then consider checking out my show, Truly Twisted, wherever you get your podcasts. Hi, my name is Alicia Watson, and each Thursday I will be bringing you a twisted story that is always victim-focused and fact-based. My goal is simple, bringing a voice to the voiceless. So be sure to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at It's Truly Twisted. And for more on my show and other amazing creators, visit fireeyesmedia.com. And in the meantime, remember, you are wanted, you are loved, and you deserve to be here. And I'll see you there.
Fire Eyes Media.